very good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Ting Ting, and I'm a Year 3 student from the School of Design and Environment. Welcome to You Alive, organized by NUS Alumni Relations. You Alive, launched in January 2011, is a key initiative of the NUS Alumni Advisory Board and has since featured over 50 accomplished members of the NUS community and global thought leaders. You Alive, Lifting Thought Leadership features a distinguished panel to address global issues that are significant to Singapore and beyond. Each session of You Alive is webcast live to reach a global audience. To ensure the best experience for both our live and online audience, please turn your mobile devices to a silent mode and refrain from flash photography. Please also restrict your movement in and out of the auditorium. We will be using Pigeonhole Live for our Q&A session later this evening. If you have a question for our panelists, please launch your web browser on your mobile device, go to pigeonhole.at and enter the event passcode UALIVE. Alternatively, you may also make your way to the microphone along the aisles, introduce yourself, and speak directly into them. This is essential so that the online community can hear your question. In building up to tonight's discussion, we held an essay competition on 19 August to 15 September, open to NUS alumni and students from the 6 autonomous universities and polytechnics. It sought to generate critical viewpoints and innovative solutions related to tonight's topic. May we now invite the academic lead, Associate Professor Masna Muhammad, Head of Malay Studies at the NUS Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences, on stage to share the highlights from the essay competition. Prof. Masna, please.
Hello. Okay, sorry. Mr. Edwin Tong, Senior Minister of State for Law and Health, Mr. Vishwa Sadasivan, Member, NUS Alumni Advisory Board, and Chairperson of You Alive Organizing Committee, panelist, Ms. Farah Pandit, former US Government's Special Representative to Muslim Communities, Ms. Victoria Ivory Barrell from the Singapore Management University, ladies and gentlemen. Well, in these opening remarks, I will say a few words about the essay competition, which could be called the forerunner of this evening's event. I was chair of the academic panel, which had a hand in putting together the wordings for the essay competition and then the selection of the winning essays. Besides myself, the team comprised Professor Farid Alatas, Professor E.T. Abraham, Associate Professor Khairuddin Al-Junid, Dr. Ivan Kwek, Dr. Azhar Ibrahim, and Dr. Eve Warburton. Well, together we represented our specializations in the fields of sociology of Islam, Islamic history, international relations, media anthropology, and Indonesian politics. We had the unenviable task of crafting the call for the essay, and then the assessment of some 60 essays submitted for it. Almost from the word go, the panel received some very emphatic, if not livid, reactions from among some alumni members who first received the announcement. What appeared to be a neutral phrasing of words and expressions turned out not to be. Islamophobia and its purported other side of the wrong coin, Islamic radicalism, are actually two turns of the phrase, which drew much ire from some of those who wrote in to complain about our choice of words. There were some misgivings from quarters who were either Muslims or those who spoke from the standpoint of the Muslim. The two most emotive terms which riled the complainants were the phrases Islamophobia and Islamic radicalism. These were meant to portray two sides of the wrong coin, or so we thought. Would the event be subtly providing a platform for Islamophobes? Would the event be unfairly putting Muslims and Islam in the spotlight by associating certain religious beliefs with violence? And the audacity of questioning if two wrongs can ever make a right. The two terms together came across among some as being slippery, succeeding mainly in pitting Islam on one side against its detractors on the other side. These early criticisms, thankfully, acted as our signpost or even a wake-up guide as to how the essay should be assessed. A good essay to us would be bold and innovative in presenting both mainstream or contrarian viewpoints. It would display intellectual rigor and would provide new insights as to how a familiar and tired issue could be addressed. There was much richness reflected in all the essays submitted in the form of questions posed, the contents included, and the approaches chosen. It was difficult to eventually select the winners as all the essays provided a myriad of insights to the questions in many different and compelling ways, as well as providing solutions which were just as varied. Ultimately, we were most impressed with essays which question the premises and assumptions behind this evening's event. One common thread which ran in the essays was that the fear of Muslims and Islam has become an everyday reality in today's world. In the end, we decided that the best essay would be the one that uncovers the real basis of distrust and hate. And that basis is to be found in our language and how it is used in creative or destructive ways. The best essay in this competition criticizes our use of the terms Islamophobia and Islamic radicalism. Terms like Islamophobia and Islamic radicalism may seem to occupy two sides of the same coin, but in actual fact, they don't even. The winning essay invites us to distinguish the term Islamic as referring to the essence of the religion from the term Islamist as referring to the ideology or the perpetrator behind the crimes. We should not even use the term Islamic radicalism, as in doing so, we are dismissing the positive aspects of radicalism as a tonal quality within a thought system and a body of ideas. Radicalism as politics and philosophy need not lead to violence, and neither would its proponents excuse the act of violence. As for Islamophobia, this is far from merely an attitude or a passive condition of being or something which only emerged recently. The repercussions of the pervasive use of the label Islamophobia may in fact lead to the celebration of what it represents. Islamophobia merely reinforces the already existing irrational hate against others and distorts peaceful religious causes under the guise of being defensive against them. So what were some of the other factors identified in the essays as creating divides among religious faith? These included the media, unmoderated virtual and cyberspaces, the use of religion in political agendas, and not least of all, apathy in society or an attitude of not even caring to understand people who are different from you. I hope the academic panel had done justice in its selection of the best essays. I hope this evening's forum will inform and enlighten us further on the persistent societal scourge of divisiveness, hate, and violence, and how do we move forward from this. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Prof. Masna. Without further ado, may we welcome Ms. Victoria Burrow, student winner and first runner-up of You Alive essay competition, to share her perspective on the topic, Islamophobia, Do Two Wrongs Make a Right?
Good evening, everybody. Good evening, Mr. Edwin Tong, Senior Minister of State for Law and Health, Associate Professor Masna Mohammed, Head of Malay Studies here at the National University of Singapore, and Ms. Farah Pandit, former US government representative to Muslim communities. Distinguished guests, thank you so much for being here with me tonight to talk about an issue that is so pertinent and very relevant in today's world. My name is Victoria Burrell, and I'm a Year 2 Politics, Law and Economics student at the Singapore Management University. I want to begin with a quote by Primo Levi in his autobiographical work, If This Is a Man. Primo Levi wrote, "A country is considered more civilized the more the wisdom and efficiency of its laws hinder a weak man from becoming too weak or a powerful one too powerful." Now, while Levi was referring to his brutal incarceration in Auschwitz, direct parallels can be drawn between the Nazism's systematic dehumanization of Jews and the extent to which the West's blatant oppression of Muslims today succeeds in inadvertently renewing the momentum of extremist organizations' goals. Global prejudice against Islam and the subjugation of Muslims is manifestly unjust. Islamophobia nourishes radical Islam's anti-West sentiment and ideology. However, these seemingly stark differences between Islamophobia and Islamic radicalism can be reconciled. First, global leaders must refrain from capitalizing on people's fear by perpetuating mistruths about Muslims. Second, mass media representation of Islam must avoid augmenting the false terrorist narrative. Third, greater government-backed inclusion of and education about Muslims will mitigate disinformation and shift public sentiment towards them. If we are to pave a way for a progressive and cosmopolitan world, we cannot allow a rational fear to subsume us. Both Islamophobia and Islamic radicalism share the similarity of thriving on fear-mongering and rely on grossly unsubstantiated mistruths about each other. American journalist Mohammed Bazi perfectly elucidated that Islamophobia thrives on a social climate in which all Muslims and Arabs are treated as if they are potential terrorists. Likewise, the Islamic State's ideology is built upon the idea that Western powers are profoundly hostile towards Muslims. This causal link between Islamophobia and Islamic radicalism has been reaffirmed in the recent American Department for Homeland Security intelligence assessment, which proved that government treatment of Muslims drives radicalization in both native-born and foreign-born violent extremists. Furthermore, the study confirmed that better treatment of refugees and immigrants decreases violence amongst these groups. Hence, to preserve harmony, global leaders must avoid breeding the fear and distrust of Muslims. Singapore can act as an ideal model for the globe by being at the vanguard of upholding racial and religious tolerance, by using an inclusive national identity to unite rather than divide people. A sustainable solution to Islamophobia would be greater government-backed education about and appreciation for Muslims and Islam. There is only so much that name-blind university or job applications can do if a wide majority of the population are still largely misinformed. Correcting public perception towards Muslims is key. A deeper understanding of Muslims and Islam will alleviate the conflict between Islam and democracy by increasing accurate public knowledge of what Islamic faith truly is. Furthermore, this ensures that Muslim minorities do not question their place or value in society and instead feel like they truly belong in the national fabric of whichever nation they inhabit. Islamophobia fans the flames of Islamic radicalization. To combat this, a more sophisticated understanding of Muslims and Islam will raise greater public awareness about the insidious consequences of Islamophobic beliefs and rhetoric, both of which are never justified. If we are to have any hope in ensuring that Islamophobia becomes a relic of the past, constantly educating ourselves and being actively critical of our own prejudices is paramount towards shaping a far more inclusive world where Muslims can feel safe, valued, and respected. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Victoria. Ladies and gentlemen, may we invite the panel on stage. Firstly, we have Mr. Edwin Tong, Senior Minister of State for Law and Health, Ms. Farah Pandif, former U.S. government representative to Muslim communities, and lastly, Associate Professor Masna Mohamad, Head of Malay Studies at the NUS Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences. The session will be moderated by Mr. Viswa Sadasivan, former nominated Member of Parliament, Chairperson of the You Alive Organizing Committee, and member of the NUS Alumni Advisory Board.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
Yeah, Prof. Okay, are you ready? I don't get the answer. Come on, guys. Are we ready? Okay. All right. So, the purpose of You Alive. We started You Alive to lift the intellectual climate in the university. That's really what the intention was. And to lift the thinking on important global issues that have a strong resonance with Singaporeans. Right. This often means that we seek to address issues that are sensitive or even taboo, but in an open and honest manner, and at the same time, in a manner that is responsible and accountable. It's in this light that we decided on Islamophobia as a topic for tonight. No matter how sensitively we try and craft it, as Masna highlighted, I'm sure that there will always be some individuals amongst us who are uncomfortable about some aspects of the phrasing and who are disturbed by some aspects of the phrasing. But that doesn't mean that we should not explore it. We should take the chance in the sense that at the end of the day, we would have more confluence of ideas than discordance. In the next 1.5 hours, I think it's going to be less than 1.5 hours, let's focus on understanding better what Islamophobia is, how prevalent it is, what's causing it, what are the consequences if it's allowed to run its course, how do we deal with it? Time's short, so I'd strongly urge that we avoid a debate on definitions or semantics. Let's get down to the brass tacks of the issue. Let me kick off the discussion by sharing some very disturbing information that I came across in the course of researching this topic. In a 2016 report by the University of California, Berkeley, and the Council on American Islamic Relations, it was clearly stated that an estimated $206 million was funded to 33 right-wing groups in the USA. The express purpose of channeling $206 million, quote, to promote prejudice against or hatred of Islam and Muslims between the years 2008 and 2013. This is from a reputable group that researched it, which includes researchers from the University of California, Berkeley. In fact, there's been other research studies, research papers that were presented, including in respected publications like Foreign Policy, that actually argued that this movement started actually soon after 9/11 in the USA, quote, where a small but powerful network of funders and ideological activists has waged a major misinformation campaign seeking to cast Islam as a diabolical threat that must be eradicated, end quote. The movement was so well organized that it actually has come to be called Islamophobia Industry or Islamophobia Inc. Right. Now, so with that, I'd like to seek the views of my panelists. We have decided that there's not going to be any opening statements. We want to go right into the debate itself, the question. So my first question to the panelists would be, what exactly is Islamophobia? Is Islamophobia about Islam, the religion, or is it targeted at those who practice the religion or who profess to practice the religion. What exactly is it? We'll have a warm-up discussion on this. Who'd like to go first? Should we ask the minister to go first? What do you think? Yeah.
I'll go first. Well, first of all, Viswa, thank you very much. I think before I go into the question, I'd like to say that an occasion like this, where we come together, have a mature discourse, we agree, we disagree, I think that's really a big step forward.
Yeah.
And whether we might come to different views or not on tonight's topic, I think this is what a mature society should be doing, to discuss sensitive topics like this in an open forum and take questions. Yeah. Islamophobia, I think, there are many definitions, but to me it represents a deep, deep, serious misunderstanding of Islam and of Islamic teachings. And it's also irrational. And so because of these two reasons, to answer your question, I don't think it is directed specifically at teachings or at the text or at persons or at practices, but I think it's just born out of the distrust and fear. And because the Islamic person, the Muslim, is the only tangible representation of that, I think a lot of that fear and anger and resentment and distrust is directed towards the person. So you find that you have occasions where you have hate speech directed at Muslims. You have more serious acts of violence, including deaths directed at Muslims. And I think that's my own definition of Islamophobia. I don't think there's one broad definition, but I do think that the Muslims bear the brunt of it. And ultimately, it's born out of a deep, irrational misunderstanding of Islam.
Thank you. Farah?
You know, one of the things that I think is important for us to think about as you ask this question is, where are we today in 2019, 18 years after 9/11? Because I think when we are all looking at this issue, it's a pre-9/11 world and a post-9/11 world. And in the context of that, what the minister was saying about fear is a really important one. You know, when I was special representative to Muslim communities, I never used the term Islamophobia precisely because no matter where in the world I went, it meant a different thing to different people. And I think it's and I know we're not having a conversation about what term to use. So I'm going to answer the question by saying to you, I don't use that terminology. I think it's very problematic for a lot of different reasons, but fundamentally, it means that when you're trying to have a dialogue with somebody, two different people are having two different conversations about different things. So if we are talking about a change on planet Earth, post 9/11, vis-a-vis how people think about Islam, how people think about Muslims, what they think they know, what they're afraid of, all of those things go into that term and terminology, and I think we are reeling from an us versus them set of ideologies, not just about Muslims, not just about, one particular religion or one particular ethnicity or one particular, we are seeing a rise of hate globally. We're seeing a rise of us versus them globally. So in the context of all of that, the rise of anti-Semitism, the rise of, whatever it happens to be, including the hatred or the fear or the misunderstanding around Muslims and Islam. This is how I think about these issues. It's not isolated. It is in the context of something much larger.
So you don't think that the hatred or antipathy towards Muslims or Islam as a religion or ideology, you don't think that that stands out from the attitude towards other religions? You don't think...
That's not what I'm saying. I want to be really clear. I think that your stats are really important. The data that we can see globally around the impact of human societies against Muslims has dramatically changed and increased, the percentage numbers of how much shift and change varies in different parts of the world, but for me in my own life, talking to communities of Muslims all over the world, whether I was in China, whether I was in Britain, whether I was in Suriname, no matter where in the world I went, you were hearing from communities talking about the change post 9/11. So I will say to you, for sure there's a difference. But then you look at data that comes comes out of the Anti-Defamation League or the Southern Poverty Law Center, two very important organizations in the United States that track hate, and you will see that indeed, side by side with the change in attitude and understanding around Muslims is also a change in the relationship between ethnicity, race, sexuality, gender. All of these things have increased.
Right. And I guess a related question to all the panelists is this. When we talk about Islamophobia, quite often we refer to a phobia against the religion per se. But in some other instances, for example, when you look at the what's happened to the Uyghurs in China, if you look at the Rohingya in Myanmar, or for that matter, the Syrian refugees, when you look at that, is it really about Islam, or is it about a historic sort of distrust with a particular group of people, which doesn't have that much to do with the religion per se, but more with the culture and more with politics of the day? Masna?
Well, I think it's very important to kind of look at the etymology or the origin of the concept itself, or the word Islamophobia, because I don't think it's attached to any other religion. You don't have Hindu phobia or Christian phobia. So I think it's very important to go to the root source of the word. But having been out there in society, Islamophobia, I think is now being used to justify, as I said earlier, to justify actions that were already there in the first place. The irrational hate against a certain group, which already existed in society. So basically now you have this term, you invoke this phrase, and you say that it's basically because. Well, sometimes Islamophobia is used to justify an action that was a result of, say, Muslim terrorism or something to that effect. So your case about the Rohingyas in Myanmar, the enmity had been there for many, many years. Now, why is it that this time they are saying that you have this Islamophobia creating the reaction against the Rohingyas? So I think, it takes on a life of its own, I think, Islamophobia. It becomes the rationale, the justification for what you think, should be done to this group of people whom you've always hated in any case.
And it kind of legitimizes or resurrects, in some case, the old issues that you may have.
Yes.
And you're able to ride on this current.
Yeah, you have a name. You have a name for it now. So it goes, I think it's the same for any other phenomenon, not just Islamophobia. Once the community has a name for it, it takes on a life of its own.
Right. Victoria?
Yeah, I mean, from my research and my understanding, it's like you've mentioned, the minute you have a term to identify these misfounded sentiments that are never justified, it's almost like trying to legitimize racism, which is never okay in any form. But yeah, now I mean, the usage of the term itself is problematic, and I've used it in my essay, but it carries with it kind of great power as well. You can see leaders around the world that are using it very casually, and like most of what's been mentioned, a justification of pretty much any hate speech, hate attack, whether it's in kind of subtle racism or more overt forms. So I think, okay, the use of the word is dangerous, and yeah, I agree with pretty much everything that's been said. Yeah.
Talking about power, what's the effect on the world, on people around the world, and on people who are moderate, who haven't formed an opinion about this matter? What's the effect that statements made by people of power and influence have in the global plane? I mean, for example, the recent statement by President Trump about the assassination, that was not the only time President Trump, quote him, 2016, he said, "I think Islam hates us." I mean, very categoric statement. I think Islam hates us. I don't think the "I think" was necessary, Well, Boris Johnson, both of them have similar hairstyles. I don't know whether that allows, that explains this. Is it pure coincidence? Well, there could be some genetic thing here. To many non-Muslim readers of the Quran, Islamophobia seems a natural reaction Islam is the problem. One is the president of the USA, the other is the president of Great Britain. Sorry, Prime Minister. You see, okay, Prime Minister of Great Britain. And the thing here is, okay, much as we can make comments, we can laugh, we can shrug our shoulders when it comes to these comments, they still have power. They still influence and shape attitudes. You know, so let's ask the person with the most power here. What do you think?
Not sure about that. But I think to build on what Masa said earlier, the moment you give these labels, you sort of legitimize it, like Victoria says. I mean, the word phobia actually, in my view, underrepresents what this actually is. I mean, arachnophobia is a fear of spiders, but this has got nothing to do with the same kind of fear. It's actually a word used to give some justification to the way in which you treat Muslims, you treat Islamic teachings, and the way in which you react sometimes very violently against them. And it just doesn't help when world leaders, prominent as they are, President, Prime Minister, comes up with these statements. Because when you make speeches like this, you make characterizations and labels like this, especially coming from high places, I think that shapes behavior. And that fans that kind of sentiment. And if you watch, I mean, if you were a child, you watch your parents label people, label behavior, justify behavior in this way, you think it's normal.
Yeah.
So what do people in the US and the UK do? Their leaders are saying this. Is it a short form way of trying to justify what they're trying to do in terms of the wars? Possibly. But I think it has a downstream impact that is very serious.
That's right.
You mentioned earlier on at the start, what do we do if this is unchecked?
Yeah.
Where it gets on. And I think with these kind of world leaders making these points, the risk of it getting away with it and being unchecked is much, much higher.
Much higher.
Much higher.
Yeah. And Vara, you've traveled to how many countries in your...
When I was special representative, I traveled to nearly 100. But I do want to make a comment about President Trump as somebody who served as a political appointee for 3 American presidents, George H.W. Bush, George W. Bush, and Barack Obama. I do have some experience in understanding how careful we have been and what we need to do as a nation in terms of how we speak about others. And I would say this not just for the U.S. or for the U.K., but globally. Isn't it up to us to make sure that all leaders, all people in power, positions of authority, have the right to treat people with dignity and respect, regardless of whether they are in the United States or they're in, pick your country, whether they're a mayor or a governor, or whether they're a CEO of a corporation. I think that is a baseline for human behavior, that you should treat and speak with civility with each
decency.
other. Decency. Having said that, there's a dangerous element to when somebody like a president or a prime minister decides to go in a different direction in the context of very real enemies globally that use words against others and actually build momentum, violent momentum, which is where some of the fear comes from. And it is related. I mean, I separate very dramatically a conversation about radicalization and extremism and terrorism from fear of Muslims. There is a line that connects if you talk about it from an emotional point of view, but there are 2 different systems that we're talking about here. So I want to say that. But when a president decides to say something as horrible as, Islam is this or
hates us.
Muslims are that, what it does in a rational way for a generation made up of Victoria's, and this is actually about her generation, that's what we're talking about here. What it sets up is sound bites. It sets up a legacy online that can never be eradicated. It allows bad actors like the so-called Islamic State or Al-Qaeda to take words of world leaders and manipulate them to recruit. So I think about it from a very dangerous perspective, as well as from simply a human perspective. It is not right to speak of the other in that way, obviously.
What's the effect, if I may ask? What's the effect in terms of it spreading beyond your own country, right? I mean, clearly the impact of President Trump's statements go way beyond
Of course.
Yeah,
the
absolutely.
geography of the USA, right?
So can I just
What's the effect of
I
that?
just want to say some data, and I know
Yeah.
this audience already knows this, but let me just put this in context. 1/4 of the planet is Muslim.
Yeah.
Okay? There are 1 billion Muslims under the age of 30. Okay? That's what we're talking about here. So for young kids growing up, hearing an us versus them around Islam and Muslims all day, every day, offline and online, hearing it from world leaders, hearing it from school teachers, hearing it from your parents, it changes the way you interpret who you are. And that's extremely dangerous for so many reasons. And it disrupts society. We want to build inclusive societies. We want to bring in societies that are diverse and are respectful of each other. It cannot happen if you are only hearing about things in this way. So I think there are many levels to what the impact actually is, from the minor, if you can even call it minor and mild, to the most severe, when a terrorist organization will use the words of a president to recruit.
You said earlier that it's up to us
Yes.
to control and manage what the leaders say. Is it really up to us?
The way in which we respond to how our leaders speak can have great impact on what they do. And you will hear terminology twisted and tweaked and polished based on polling data, based on the impact from a headline on a paper, based from a whole, from many, many things. There are teams of people that monitor these things to figure out what's working and what isn't. If they get positive reinforcement that a particular term or a particular set of things that they put out there have legs, they're going to run with it. Let me give you an example, by the way, which is connected. Can you remember before Trump the term fake news? Did you ever hear that?
No.
And now the world, that's all anybody talks about. It's true, right? He didn't coin the phrase fake news, but he used it a lot. He used it a lot and a lot and a lot, and now that's what we talk about. So I contrast that to a leader that might use the word compassion or mutual respect or inclusion. If that's the word or the terminology they're using all the time, what's the impact for communities? It's, oh, okay, we're talking about mutual respect.
Yeah, yeah. I think this is about the right time for us to throw the discussion open to the floor. Questions, comments, anyone? Did you all have something very heavy to eat before this? Yes, the man in red.
There's a mic up
There's
there.
a mic up there. You got to walk.
Hi, my name is Yeo Keng Jun, NUS alumni. My question is this. Prior to what happened in Colombo, was it last year or year before?
Last year.
We always thought that the extremists,
This year.
This year.
the extremists are those who are at the lowest level of poverty, but the Sri Lankan perpetrators were rich family.
Yeah.
So my question is, this radicalization of these guys is very worrying, and therefore, as a non-Muslim, we are concerned that it's such a powerful religion that it cuts across all levels of society among the Muslims.
Well, this issue about the causal connection between poverty and terrorist activities, right?
Yes.
That actually has been debunked. It was a theory several years ago, but that has been debunked. In fact, it was a theory soon after 9/11. And you're absolutely right. A lot of people who are involved in terrorist activities physically on the ground are not your caricatures, not your standard long beard and stuff. Many of them are clean shaven. Many of them are highly educated. You see what I mean? So these caricatures don't work anymore. But let's hear from Masna. Do you have a view on this?
I think it's if you want to do any act, any terrorist act, I think you can do it in the name of any religion. That's the first thing, because you can dip into any of your theological resources to justify, acts of violence. Why? I think that your question about Islamic terrorism, again, you see the labeling of Islamic being, the terrorism being Islamic. I think I'm just speaking on behalf of the essayists. So they say that you shouldn't use the term Islamic, but it is actually Islamist, an Islamist form of terrorism. It's the ideology behind it rather than the religion behind it. So because when you associate terrorism with the religion, then I think it's not fair for the millions and billions of Muslims who are actually not doing that sort of act.
Yeah.
And the idea about terrorism, it's not, I think, confined to any religion. I think history has shown us that, it can happen, with any religion, whether it's Christianity, Catholicism, Hinduism, Buddhism, but could be because we're giving more attention to Islam in this time than before. And why is that so? I think that's the main question. As Farah has said, there's a post-9/11 kind of consciousness, and it's somehow or other that narrative has become stronger instead of weaker, and people are being kind of reinforced and strengthened, through that narrative.
Right.
Yeah.
I think
But the narrative around the world has actually strengthened that belief.
Right.
Because, post 9/11, you've seen the rise of Al-Qaeda, you see ISIS, you see Islamic states. And I don't think there was that connection previously.
Right.
And I think all of that, plus what our world leaders say on a big platform, I think just reinforces and cements that view. And so that gentleman's point, I think what you're trying to get at was, you can't quite say that you can have a typology for a typical person who might be radicalized. And I think that is precisely the concern that we have.
Yeah.
If you remember a few weeks ago, there were 3 domestic workers in Singapore who were detained because they were found to have been radicalized online. So, of course, Masna is right. It's not just in the province of Islam or for Muslims. But I think the fact that has happened, I think it's what concerns the average citizen on the street. Because you now can't quite identify a typical typology for it. And I think that's the point behind the gentleman's question.
Yeah.
Can,
Yes, please.
Sir, I think you ask a really important question, and it is connected very much with the conversation around the experience of Victoria's generation. Whether you are a millennial or you're a Generation Z, these are digital natives. These are kids who have grown up in the context of 9/11, who have grown up learning about themselves. What we know 18 years after 9/11 is that education levels, financial levels have no bearing on whether or not somebody finds the ideology of the so-called Islamic State or Al-Qaeda or Boko or Shabab, any of these groups that use Islam for their nefarious ends. Okay? What we know, what the data tells us, is that for these young people growing up, they are asking themselves questions about who they are. What does it mean to be modern and Muslim? What's the difference between culture and religion? This question around identity and belonging is what is the first component to how somebody begins to ask themselves, does the ideology of the extremists make sense to me? It's the way gangs recruit, it's the way others recruit, that's the first thing. And so the reason why that is important is because in the conversation around hating the other, in the conversation around how is the world talking about issues around Muslims, it has great bearing on this idea of identity. Because if that's all they're seeing, if they are always feeling as though they are the victims, it makes a difference. I also just want to say one other thing. We can sit here and talk about what happened in Sri Lanka because we're in this part of the world. But let me be really clear about one thing. There is great interest, and rightly so, of extremist groups that use Islam for their nefarious ends, but we are also seeing horrifically the rise of neo-Nazis,
Yeah.
the rise of white supremacists, and we are watching, whether it's in Christchurch or we're watching it in Oslo or wherever it is, these extremisms are connected to each other because they're learning from each other in terms of tactic and in terms of impact. So what we have to be thinking about in terms of all of these things, sir, is not a question of how rich or poor you are, not whether or not you're in this part of the world or another part of the world. It's what's happening to the demographic of millennials and Generation Z around the world because they're connected to each other.
What's coming through in this conversation is that if we talk about the issue, such as Islamophobia, or call it by whatever other name, if you talk about it, the more you talk about it, you're bringing it to sharp relief. And more people will then start talking about the negatives. But if you don't talk about it, you're not going to start having the process that heals. I mean, I'd like to see that this is part of a process that seeks to heal. The fact that we can sit here and talk openly, fairly openly, demonstrates that there is a certain level of trust already. So there is this dilemma. If you talk about it, and perhaps if you don't use the right language, or you keep stressing the negative words, it will have the effect of getting more people to think negatively about the issue.
Right.
And if you don't talk about it, you're not going to move forward, right? So the question here is, how do we deal with this issue, this dilemma that we are facing? And with the focus on identity that you talked about, and with the focus on language and the connotations of language. So I see some hands
Can I,
like moving.
Sorry,
Yes.
Vishwa. I just want, on that point, I just want to kind of say what one of the essays that brought up, which we were quite impressed with, and that we shouldn't dismiss Islamophobes, right?
Yeah.
We need to engage with them. Because Islamophobia itself is actually located within a spectrum. So you have many reasons why people are against, for example, well, so-called Islam. They could be other religious groups who see Islam as a rival, as a rival religion. But they could also be on the other end of the spectrum, the secularists, who are just against any rise of religion. So do we call these two groups, equally Islamophobes? So we need to go deeper, and I think we shouldn't dismiss people who have concerns, about Islam. We need to see where they're coming from. So I just want to bring that up because I think that's a very impressive point that was brought up in one of the essays.
Yeah. Zainal, I know you wanted to ask a question, right? Or were you just holding your nose or something? No, you have a question. Okay, before that, let's ask the millennial. Okay. So what do you think?
Okay, I'll try and string together a lot of what's been happening. I think back to Farah Pandit's point about people growing up and trying to figure out their identity. I think that's so important. I mean, from some of my Muslim friends, it's gotten to a point where you just want to be seen as human, first and foremost. And you're proud of your identity, you're proud of your race and your religion. That certainly forms a huge part of who you are. But first and foremost, you want to be seen as a human being. Because almost Islamophobia has become a thing where it's wrapped up like you can't get rid of this stigma when that's just not a reflection of who you are. And I think back to your point about the kind of contention between having the discussion versus keeping silent. I think I have to say that we need to have the conversation because, I mean, in Singapore, we're very fortunate that our government's done a fantastic job at maintaining the harmony, but at the same time, I think complacency is just as dangerous. And complacency is very dangerous because then you almost become deaf or numb or blind to being able to see, Islamophobia or this kind of irrational fear creeping back in the door. I think you have to. It's not a game you can be complacent, and you always have to be highly sensitive and not hypersensitive at the same time. I do want to be clear on that, but you have to be very aware of when words are not okay, when they shouldn't be used, what kind of attitudes are not allowed. So Yeah, and then back to the point about youth again, jumping back there. I mean, we can educate young people, but at the same time, you know, the internet and social media usage is very, because if you learn in classrooms that Muslims and Islam is this way, like if you're teaching it properly, but then you open up your social media and a torrent of misinformation
Yes.
is just streaming nonstop from the minute you get up to the minute you go to sleep, even flicking through during meal times, it's quite hard for you to, as a young person, to figure out what is right. So I think it would be nice if you had great big organizations actively working alongside to make sure that this kind of disinformation doesn't get out of hand. I think it is in their interests and the interests of the survival of just human beings living together, coexisting, living in a tolerant, understanding society, that both these corporations can help to facilitate and maintain a sense of cohesion, I think. Yeah.
Right.
Well, I'd like you to hold that thought. You know, it begs the question, who should initiate and drive these dialogues? Whether it should be government or whether it should be a lot more from the ground, whether there should be a stronger civil society movement that talks about this. We can talk about that in a while, right? But Zainal. Can you run? Well done, my friend. Give him a hand.
Thank you, Vishwa. I have a question on it's up to us and inclusivity, which I think you mentioned just now. But just before that, I think you all know that I'm not a millennial.
No, you're kidding.
Oh, no,
really?
what a surprise.
I'm 71, but when I was of Victoria's age, I was faced with the same kind of questions. I was invited by Gaddafi, President Gaddafi, to attend an international youth conference in Libya. And basically he was saying that the West is decadent, Soviet Union is going to collapse, Islam is the only answer. Carry the Islamic flag, banner, and let's rally the whole world to fight the non-Muslims. But the point of which I am coming to is that it's up to us. The whole conference, the leaders, the young leaders, stood up against Gaddafi and said, no, we're not here for exclusivity, but we are here for inclusivity. So coming to this question about inclusivity, it's up to us. So do Muslim leaders do stand up. But today the whole problem with the Muslim world is that leadership, lack of leadership, and they're all in a mess. Middle East is in a mess. So my question is, when it comes to standing up, speak up to us, and inclusivity, where do you see this model among the Muslims? Singapore, you mentioned, is a model. But even in Singapore now, we hear people saying, the problem with Malays, I mean, Malays, we love you, but we Muslims, extremism, the isms, the way of life, even Arabism became an issue. So where is this model we can look for? Malaysia, we see the problems of race and religion in politics. Indonesia, a lot of question marks too. So where do we have this model for Muslims to stand up and say, it's up to us, and we want inclusivity? Thank you.
Thank you.
Before, one more.
Yep.
You know, that time you were alive, I think, which I remember we thought about it in the committee. I didn't realize that when we had that name, I didn't realize that Islam is on fire. But the Vishwa will remember to that, because I'm reassured, because now is Deepavali Valtikal. So let there be more light, and with names like Farah Pandit, that helps. Thank you.
Okay, now you're going into political statement. Huh? Okay, thank you. Minister.
Let me try and answer the millennials question. I actually think that you don't have to ask yourself, what is that one model you look at? Because I believe that each society, each country is different. We can't look at the Malaysians or the Indonesians, because the order and the makeup of their society is fundamentally different from ours. We are the most diverse country in the world, racial, religious-wise. We have the smallest living space. We're all densely located with each other. So I think we have to create our own rules. And I think we've been doing that since we became independent. The day we were thrown out of Malaysia, we've had no choice but to do that. And so we set up a system that works for us. And that system, I think, is a combination of what the state does through its rules. We have legislation that sets out the outer parameters, what those boundaries might be. We have Sedition Act, we have the Maintenance of Religious Harmony, which has just been updated. We have laws that govern what you can say. And then we have a government that is agnostic to any particular race or religion. And it's got to be so. It organizes its affairs, it makes its decisions, not based on race or religion, but based on what's in the best interests of the country. And you then look at the organizations that's been set up, social policies that's been set up. We don't have enclaves. We ensure that all our public housing, you have a breakdown of racial representation in each public housing. Schools, universities are universal. Government pays a large part of it. Schooling is compulsory. Everyone goes to school. Whether you're Chinese, Malay, Muslim or Hindu, Buddhist, all go to school. And then we have organizations that the government supports. IRCC, IROs, we have NGOs that are set up. We have the Harmony Fund. I think you're all familiar with that. All of these are different segments of society coming together within the rubric that has been set up. And I think that works for us because we create a situation and an environment that is special to Singapore. How do we tolerate, how do we promote racial and religious harmony? All of that happens in this rubric. So I would say to Zainal, I wouldn't look at one model and say, let's look at this Islamic leader or Muslim leader and let's take the cue from that. I think we take our own cue. We haven't gotten it all right all the time. And I think we've had to improve. So we've had councils like MUIS. Recently we've set up the Asatiza accreditation because we realized that there was a gap when preachers come in. So we continue to work at it, refine it, but I think it must be what works for us, what works for our society, what works for the kind of makeup that we have in our society, and not look to borrow from other countries.
If I could just expand on that point, right? I think, Zainal, if I read you correctly, Singapore has got it more or less fairly well, I must say, right? And generally there's acknowledgement. We're multiracial, we have been able to learn critical lessons from 1964 riots and so on, right? The question is, it's something that, Farah, you talked about earlier, how do we balance the voices in the world? There's so much of negativity and hate speech at this point in time that is dominating conversations around the world. How do we make sure that that's balanced with voices of reason? And not just voices of reason in terms of rhetoric, but voices of reason that come from having been there and done it. And I think the world needs to hear those voices. The question is, how do these voices, an example of which is Singapore, how do these voices actually get onto the international platform? Farah.
So I may be really unpopular here, but
Go for it.
I'm going to go for it. So first of all, sir,
yeah.
I have just written a book called How We Win, okay? And I make an argument in that book that all of us means all of us. The government sector, the corporate sector, and regular citizens. Okay, it cannot be imbalanced. And I will argue that there isn't a country in the world that is doing it right. Okay, we all can do better at building the kind of resilience in communities so that us versus them doesn't exist, okay, across the board. And specifically to your point, this is where I'm going to be super unpopular. You know, after 9/11, we thought the guy with the longest beard and the highest hat saying that violence in the name of Islam would be super great and that nobody would get radicalized because of it and would solve all of our problems. And we set up all these alliances and partnerships where we had coalitions of people who are Muslim majority states who were all, you know, from a military dimension, that is great. And we need that. And from a political dimension, it's fantastic. We need to check the box. Yes, the UN did this. The Arab League did this. The Organization of the Islamic State did this. I mean, we go through our things. But you know what? For millennials and Generation Z, they don't care about that stuff. They care about their peers. So who's the all of us? It's the people that government people never go to. It's what's in the culture. It's the people who are the peers that have credibility, that have viability, nuanced viability, neighborhood to neighborhood. It's a hip hop artist. It's a graffiti artist. It's a poet. It's an entrepreneur. It's a whoever it happens to be that makes sense. And understanding that cultural component is vital for us because that's what's in the ether. That's what actually sets us all up to understand how we feel about hate for the other. And whether it's against Muslims or Jews or black or white or Hindu, Muslim, I don't know what it is. All of those cultural cues make a difference. So when you're asking this question, I have to say to you, we've got to be more entrepreneurial about how we think about who the cultural influencers are. And we've got to get real with corporations in terms of what they stand for. There's an entire conversation to be had about what technology companies ought to be doing, okay? That is an entire thing we can go very deeply on. But I make the argument that in today's world, where corporate purpose is very important to the generations that are buying things, that a company needs to stand for something. And standing for fighting hate is a pretty great thing to stand for. Right? So what can a company do day to day to be able to send out the signals that that's what they're all about? And then I get to the third part, which is a regular citizen. Who are we? Who are we? We've been so lazy on hate. We've allowed it to bloom. And I would argue that, look, we've got to look within ourselves too. How are we talking about the other? What are we doing in daily lives? All of these little data points are together. So to answer your question on all of us, that is all of us. And unless we understand that, the consequences can be very dangerous for the future of our planet. Because if we allow this to pass, and it's okay, it's just the Muslims, we're doing it with the Muslims, or we're doing it with the Jews, or we're doing it with the blacks, or we're doing it with the whites, I mean, everything's fine. We're all of a sudden going to be so tribal and so disrupted that our fabric of our societies will be torn in such a way that they can never be repaired. So I look at this with a sober viewpoint on this, having had the great privilege of serving my country, but also having the great privilege of talking to tens of thousands of Muslim youth around the world. I come to it not with a position of desperation and that we'll never be able to do it. I come to this with, boy, solutions are available and affordable right now. We just need to get with the program and do it the way we know it can be done.
But Farah, can I ask you a question about the second all of me, which is the corporates and,
Yes.
and the influencers and the peers? Do you think that's realistic? I mean,
Yes.
to expect that corporates would conduct themselves around a theme? Yes, it might be, but ultimately corporates are set up for profits,
Absolutely.
commercial motivations. We can't even get the biggest platform of news that young people go to nowadays, Instagram, social media, Facebook, to play ball and to look at online falsehoods properly, to look at hate speech properly, when their primary motivation really is eyeballs, and eyeballs bring profits. So how do you think we can achieve that in the context of social influencers, corporates, and of course peers of the millennials?
Let's take it outside of the technology companies for a second. And I've spent a lot of time looking at what companies were doing around specific issues. For example, climate change, or things that were not in their wheelhouse, but they knew were important for them. Of course, they're private sector companies. Of course, they should be making a profit. That's what they do. They're not public sector companies. But you look at a company like Unilever. You look at the change that they made globally in taking part in things that they knew were going to help build communities and make them stronger. maybe they didn't take on extremism and hate, but they took on things like greener awareness. They took on things that would normally you would say, why is the company even thinking about that? Doesn't make a difference. It in fact impacts their bottom line. The supply chains for these companies are affected when communities are not stable, are they not? That's one piece. There's a profit piece there. I take an example too. I grew up in Massachusetts. For those of you who may know Boston, and you know that the Boston bombing attack that happened on the Boston Marathon, I use that example in my book because that city, Boston, shut down for 3 days after that bomb went off. You know how much money they lost? Because their people were not able to go to work. So I can take a very corporate perspective. What is it going to mean if you can't fight hate? Is there a rational component? There are industry after industries, whether it's airlines, whether it's tourism, whether it is commerce that is built off of other things that you might not even connect to extremism and hate. It matters. The after effect matters. So we can make the case for companies, even though they are not thinking that way right away. And we have. And the last point I'd make, Mr. Minister, is that the American Business Roundtable recently, I'm sure you saw it, and the FT has been writing all about this, has been talking about corporate purpose, right? That companies, it's not just about the bottom line, it's also about making, right. And I look at that and I see that as an opportunity for us to open up the aperture on the kinds of things that they can think about, and human resilience within communities has to be something that we look at and demand change to do.
Well, I hope you're right, because I think they would be a big influence on the population that really matters.
Yes.
And the Victoria generation.
And starting with the employees.
Yes.
We have about half an hour left. The clock is ticking. So here's what I propose. Right, we need to step up the pace of the discussion. I'd like to hear more questions, more and shorter responses, so that we can have a really good dialogue. Right? Can we start moving towards just those with the hands up? Just move towards the microphones, please. Yeah. Anyone else? So we can save time. So while you're there, who wants to go first?
Yeah.
Okay. Why don't we have the gentleman on the left?
Hello. Yep. My name is M.J. Pillay. I'm an NUS alumni, unemployed at the moment.
He's not an employee.
I thought I'll just bring the problems a little bit closer to home. It's something that's been bugging me for years. Dr. Goh Keng Swee, in 1967, when he presented or tabled the Enlistment Act in Parliament, he said, "Nothing creates loyalty and national consciousness more speedily and more thoroughly than participation in defense and membership of the armed forces." Despite such a noble goal, Malays were deliberately excluded from NS enlistment into the SAF for a long time under misconceived perception that Malays as a community could not be trusted, with the view that they would naturally align with the ethnic and religious brethren in Malaysia and Indonesia in the event of a war, or experience a conflict of interest. So while the post-independence rhetoric called for a united and multicultural Singapore, the government found it apt to halt Malay presence in the SAF. So I contend that the Singapore government indulged in Islamophobia, maybe unintentionally, but 50 years ago, long before 9/11, and is continuing to do so as far as the SAF is concerned. Does the panel have any comments?
I think the minister may have a comment. Yeah. Thank you for your question.
I do think you got to take the comment in context. I think he's quoting from Dr. Goh, but I think you must look at the world order at that point in time. You must look at ASEAN at that point in time. And you remember the bombings that happened in Singapore. And I think it was a very different context then. But if you look at the SAF today, the army as a whole, I think the Malays do very well. They occupy senior positions and offices. They take positions across the different services of the army. And I would challenge you to come up with statistics now, today, that makes good the point which you made earlier, that Malays are excluded from, and I forget the language you use, but Malays are excluded effectively from enlistment and from serving the national service because they are Malays. And I think that is very far away from where we are today. And the only answer I have for you in terms of the comment that was made up front is that you must look at the circumstances in which it was made and the role in which Singapore found itself in the context of ASEAN and the conflicts that were happening at that point in time.
Yeah. So I take your point in general that there can be a lot more progress in that area in terms of, and I would say let's leave it at that for now and move on to the next question. You can have a conversation with the minister or anyone else outside later, but I see that I'm saying this only because I see quite a few hands and we have 27 minutes, yeah? But I think your point is made and the minister has responded. Let's move on. Yes.
Namaste to all. I'm Monesh from India. I'm a yoga teacher in Singapore in Lotus Yoga. This is my simple introduction. Actually, as ma'am told, 26/11 happened in Australia, in America. Same 26/11 in Mumbai also. Why this fear only for the Muslims? Because they have like this speech, as well as just recently UN meeting happened, what that Pakistan PM told. He directly tell more than 10 to 20 times the Hindu, Hindu, Hindu. Because of, he speak lot of times, he speaks so many words to why we have the atomic power. If someone hear the speech, what the PM told in United States America, we have atomic power, that is both country are facing each other. What is the speech? They have timing only the 50 minutes, he speak 45 minutes only about the India. And everyone know India is the suffering now, the terrorist. I am every day watching few hours in the debate. Recently, yesterday also happened in terrorist, in India only 5 people killed. Recently I am telling, more than 200 people died in 26/11 in Mumbai. It's a natural, then we feel like a...
Okay, I'll have to stop you here because it's becoming a speech, right? No, I think your point is made.
My few points.
You have 30 seconds.
Okay.
Yes.
Few points. Like as well as my friend Singapore, she told, Monesh, we have fear to the Muslims. I told, why? She told, because of here some government, like some army people, they cheat sometime to the Singapore government, they from Malay. Second, then there is the hate speech. She told they have some hate speech for the Muslims. Because we don't have much respect to that, because they something did before the Singaporean. That's why we will not give big opportunity to hear like a Indian, like a army peoples here.
Okay.
That's also my question.
Thank you. So I didn't quite understand your question. What's your question in one sentence?
My one question is, question is, why people only have fear and phobia for only the Muslims? Why not the others?
Okay, Farah. When in doubt, Farah.
Oh my gosh, how sweet
I
of
told you, I warned you. Okay.
Sir, I think I understand your question, and forgive me if I'm not answering it the same way, but I think I did answer it earlier, that there is, that the rise of hate globally is something that is quite profound right now in 2019. So it isn't just a fear for one particular religion, that there is enough hate to go around, unfortunately. I hate to even say it like that. I remember, you were talking about terminology, and I wanted to just say to you, because I thought it was very funny, I was in Kazakhstan when I was in government, and they had a panel on anti-Semitism, Christophobia, Islamophobia, and then the fourth panel was everything else. And I'm not joking. I am really not joking. Okay. But sir, the point here is, I think depending on where in the world you are seeing the us versus them in a multitude of different ways. The conversation today is around Islamophobia. That is the topic of the conversation, which is why you are hearing us talk about it. I think if we had a broader conversation about hate, you would hear different aspects to this around the world.
Yeah. Now you see why I asked her to answer it? Yeah. Thank you. Yes, please.
My name is Abdul Hakim. I'm an alumni from 1987 NUS. And previously I was from Ministry of the Environment. But of course now I've switched. I've realized that Islamic education is very important. I am now an Islamic educator. We've experienced, of course, I go around Indonesia, Malaysia, as well as Singapore, in order to learn and understand the changes that is needed by the Muslims themselves in the light of post 9/11. We really need to change the way we educate ourselves, we see the world. That is why I appreciate very much the point made by Victoria. Today, I believe we need to move more towards humanity.
Yeah.
Precisely, that is what the crux of the matter that is emphasized in Islam. In the Quran, that's what we say. We are human beings. So many times Allah repeated the same words. Oh, human being. We are human beings. We come from the same mother and father. The singularity of origin, we must beat this racism. So for me, the young people, the millennial today, in Singapore, I'm beginning to feel, my children no longer feel themselves. Whether their friends are no longer Muslims only. They mix around with everybody. So to me, this is the right direction that we must learn. That the different races are there merely for us to learn from one another and improve our relations. So that is why Farah's point to me is very important, that we increase mutual understanding between us so that we can learn some of the good cultural things that may come from from us. So what we can learn from Singapore, for the benefit of our minister here, is that there are good things from the Malays that the Chinese can learn. There are good things from the Chinese that I'm learning, such as entrepreneurship, the never say die attitude in business. And there are also important things that Indians, their cultural ballast is so strong.
Yeah.
Right? To me, this is important. That this is the right direction that we must emphasize, and this is the right solution, that we emphasize more on humanity as a way to overcome this fear of Islamophobia.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Absolutely.
Thank you. And may I add that we have a lot to learn from our young people.
Yes.
Yes,
So,
indeed.
Victoria.
Okay, I'll try, and I want to commend you and thank you for, I mean, what an amazing thing to dedicate your life towards traveling around the world and learning more from these people. I completely agree with you. I mean, coming from an interracial household, I think I've been very blessed with, from a young age, understanding people different from ourselves, and I completely agree with you. First and foremost, I think, I mean, yes, we all talk about how the language that our leaders use matters because it's supposed to represent the nation and the values that the nation has. But at the same time, I think starting from the ground up is also very important because, holding your friends accountable at the same time. I mean, making sure that if you see these kind of microcosms of bullying, that you stand up and say that's not okay. So I completely agree with you, seeing your friends and peers, regardless of race and religion and whatnot, just seeing them as humans, like I said, first and foremost, and actively trying to learn from them and understand them. That way you won't be susceptible towards misinformation, because your first port of call, all the people you're surrounding yourself by, they are living proof that whatever falsehoods may be on your mobile phone aren't true.
Right.
So yeah, I hope I've addressed your wonderful statement.
The importance of reframing the conversation, so that we are not stuck in this mold. Yes, please.
Hi, my name is Herman, and I work at the Middle East Institute. I graduated last year. We keep harping on this notion that there's something special about 9/11, but I do wonder, I would like to us to think a bit more historically, because I'm wondering if this is just one node in terms of how people have seen Islam in a long time. If we go back to the 70s, people have used the phrase Islamic revivalism, Islamic fundamentalism. If we go even further to the colonial period, there was a very concrete desire to put Islam in a specific box and to see it as an inferior civilization, if you could say that. So I'm wondering if we could see it, I mean, we keep talking about Islamophobia as something that's unique, but maybe when we see it in that sort of genealogy, it's something that's just been recurring for a long time, in the way that people have seen Islam, especially from the European point of view, and how they have conceptualized Islam as this other sort of civilization, right? So I'm just wondering about that genealogy. And my second question is, I'm is it fair to put it on Muslims to explain themselves and to put themselves on the side of not being extremists? So I'm just thinking in terms of what Goh Chok Tong said in 2002 in the National Day rally, right? When he explained this problem of Islamic radicalism as being a problem within Islam, that this is a problem that Muslims, moderate Muslims, have to deal with respect to extremist Muslims. So this is pitted as an internal Muslim problem, and that Muslims have to speak up against this issue. And I'm wondering what the panelist thinks about this. It's not just unique to Singapore leaders, of course. There are other leaders across the world that say, you know, Muslims have to speak up. You know, is it right for them to?
Thank you. Could we have 2 quick responses, please? Maybe Masna?
On the genealogy, I think you're right about the long history, right, of, well, call it what you want, whether it's rivalry or enmity between Christianity and Islamism. I mean, it would have stretched from the 16th or 15th century, you know, Latin Christendom, as they call, against the Ottoman Islamism. So that was a long, long time ago, right? And I think what's relevant here is that the contemporary Islamic movements actually use the past also to justify the actions of the present as a kind of continuity of that rivalry. So yeah, we do have to look deeper, and it's not just a surface thing. I think people do look back to the past, to the heritage of sorts. Well, that's my short answer, you see, about the genealogy. But your other question about why Muslims have to be answerable to society, right, and why not the others? I guess, well, to be fair to others, okay, I'm not just going to defend Muslims. I think, yes, they do, and it's and whether it's in Malaysia or Singapore or in the US, I think Muslims have to do more than what they're doing. I don't think they should just be defending themselves and say, no, we've been unfairly, you know, discriminated. I think they have to show more. Whether in terms of the philosophy behind the religion, in terms of racial relations, in terms of gender relations, I think Muslims have not done much. So I think that we have to move these movements in tandem, the so-called interracial engagements. Unfortunately, I suppose in this period, it's the Muslims, you know, have to be answerable. Well, that's my personal viewpoint.
But you're not saying that only Muslims, right? You're not saying that the onus is squarely on the shoulders of Muslims, but you're saying Muslims.
No, of course
Muslims should play a bigger role.
Right.
It doesn't mean that the others don't have a role, right?
No, certainly so. I mean, I don't recall the context of ESM's statement, but I for one, don't believe that this is a Muslim-only problem or an Islam-only problem. It cannot be. It doesn't make any sense for us to pigeonhole it in that way. And if you did that, all you'll be doing is to reinforcing the them and the us, and not all of us together. So I believe everyone has a role to play, Muslim, and I think one of the speakers, gentleman said earlier that we need leaders from the Muslim world to come forward. I agree. So that doubts, misapprehensions of the Muslim faith can be clarified. People outside of the Muslim faith may not know it as well as those within. Equally, we from outside the Islamic circles must take steps to understand, to engage, to know. And I think that is what we want to foster in our society. And that's the only way we can move forward as a community that is inclusive.
Right, thank you. Could we have all 3 questions at one go and then we respond in the interest of time? Yes, yeah.
First and foremost, I'd like to congratulate NUS for handling this topic, and which is very topical, and you'll have had the guts to do it, and I think it's long overdue. And as to Viswa's comment, you'd like to see much more awareness of this, but this is your converted crowd. They are not the problem. And what I see more and more happening, whether it's the US, wherever, even in Singapore, there's the left and there's the right. There's black and there's white. The shades of gray are no more as apparent as they used to be. And, you know, they belong to one camp, and whatever the other camp says or does is wrong. there's less and less of a middle ground. And from a personal observation, when we were growing up, we used to have open house for Deepavali, and all the neighbors used to come, including Muslims. But now it's becoming more difficult because of halal food and so on. And that's created a little bit of a segregation. But I still maintain that some of my best friends from school have been Muslims. I'd like to see more of that. And as you've rightly pointed out, and Inchek Rashid as well pointed, that these issues need to be addressed, but I would like to know what the middle ground in Islam is doing to address it so that they do not get misrepresented by the minority and the minority gets the limelight and the religion being characterized by this vocal minority. I'd like to see more of a middle ground happening and more discussions and less of political figures harboring the Zakir Naiks of this world. That's my comment.
Thank you. Thank you. Yes, please.
Hi, my name is Andy Wong. I'm probably the millennial here. I'm just going to lift two quick questions off Pigeonhole because they were good questions. First one, someone expressed a statement here saying secular law should protect people and not religion. Muslim people are not a problem, religion is, because it has the power to dictate human behavior. Sharia law should be replaced with civil law. What is the panel's opinion on that? That's the first question. Second one, really quick. Will censoring streaming platforms like Netflix help avoid perpetration of Islamophobia, TV shows like Homeland as prime example? Thank you.
So your question, just to get it right, Sharia law should be replaced.
The first question, basically in summary, was suggesting that the world is predominantly run by secular states with secular law, and that a major thing that Islamophobes hold against Islam and drive Islamophobia is their objection to what they see as Sharia law being apart from secular law and secular.
I understand that. So your question specifically is that Sharia law should be replaced by civil law. Is it?
Yeah, that's the question that was expressed, yes.
Got it. Thank you. Okay, yes.
Hi, so I'm Ashwin from SIM. And the reason why I'm up here was that I was quite intrigued by the earlier gentleman's question because much more recently I served most of my NS in the Air Force. And while it is true that the Army doesn't discriminate against Malays in particular to the extent that it used to in the past, my understanding throughout the time that I was doing NS in the Air Force is that the Air Force still has an unofficial policy of barring Malays and Muslims in general. In fact, I remember quite a lot discussing with a lot of my colleagues in NS. We'd often joke about how Malays were barred. And the question that was asked earlier reminded me in particular this one incident in which I remember my department in my camp had called a contractor to my unit to do some servicing and maintenance. And an ST had made the mistake of prohibiting the contractor from coming into the camp just because the contractor was Malay. So what I understand is that earlier on, Senior Minister Tong explained that the Army had this policy towards Malays because you have to take into account the geopolitical circumstances surrounding Singapore at the time. So my two questions would be, what are the geopolitical circumstances today that apparently that explain why the Air Force, why there's little to no Malay or Muslim personnel in the Air Force? And the second question is, notwithstanding those geopolitical considerations, what impression is SAF sending to the youth of Singapore when it tells successively new cohorts of conscripts that Malays don't have a high security clearance because they might be a fifth column for Malaysia or Indonesia or for a radical terrorist group, and that's why they're not in the Air Force, that's why they're not in the Navy, and or even still in some of the more high security Army units. Thank you.
Okay, yep. All right. We'll start with, thank you. Minister, maybe you want to respond to that last question.
Yeah, I'm not aware of this policy where you can't allow Malays into the Air Force or indeed in the camps. And I would like to have that discussion with you, understand your context a bit more. Because my understanding is that a lot more Malays now than before, probably because of education levels, maybe the way they perform in life, stations in society and so on. A lot more Malays end up in senior positions. A lot more Malays actually take up scholarships, even within the armed forces. And I don't think that that discrimination appears. It's based on merits, what you can achieve, how far you can go, and the line is not cast because of race. And I'd like to have the discussion with you so that I can understand your context better, and maybe take up the specific circumstances.
Yeah. But I think it may be a good idea for you to have a conversation with the Minister after this. No, I'm serious about this because first of all, I'm very happy that you feel comfortable asking this question. That in itself, I think, speaks volumes about the level of trust that we have. You know, there was a time when we wouldn't dare to come up here and ask a question of such as this. But I'm glad that you, as a young man, is prepared to come and ask this question because the assumption is it doesn't have repercussions. I'm glad you have asked this question. And give him a hand, please. Yeah.
Vishwa.
Thank you. Yes.
Just to respond to
this is a former Air Force guy.
Okay, my name is Bernard. I'm now currently Director of Public Affairs, but in my previous life, I was in the Air Force. I was head of Air Manpower. I can tell you we have Malay pilots. I know a guy who flies transport planes, Zakia. We even had a guy we sent to the United States to be trained on the F-16s. So that's to debunk your point that there are no Malays in the Air Force. There are.
Thank you. Yes, please. Question.
Hi, my name is Shivram. I'm an NUS alumnus as well. I had 2 quick points to make. The first one was regarding the term Islamophobe.
Yeah.
I think the term phobia is a very innocuous sounding term here. You know, it suggests fear, and I think Minister Tong mentioned this as well. And I think no bigot or no person who expresses hatred or discrimination towards Muslims should be able to hide behind a term like fear. Okay, it's not fear. It's a lot more than that. It's a conscious decision to be discriminatory towards someone else, and to not open one's mind to the fact that the person that is standing in front of you is a human being, like Victoria mentioned. First and foremost, a human being more than any other label that you can put on him or her. That's my first point. The second point I had was in terms of this entire debate about us versus them, and this increasing polarization that almost every society on earth seems to be undergoing, right? And we are seeing this. It's become a crescendo, right? It's about it's in the news in every major newspaper. My question to the Muslim panelists is, to a degree, do you think the pan-Islamism, the pan-Islamist nature of Islam, okay, the identifying of issues and conflicts perhaps in different geographical regions as one's own, and the embracing of what are essentially local disputes in various parts of the world as one big Muslim issue, could that be contributing also to a similar attitude being adopted by the non-Muslims, as in the coalescing of all kinds of disputes which should strictly be local political disputes in various parts of the world, okay, and making them all into one big Muslim versus non-Muslim issue?
Okay, get it. Thanks. Farah, you want to respond to that?
So, sir, I think that's an important question, but I think we need a reality check. We're in the 21st century. Yeah. You know, I mean, everything is connected because of the very nature of how we live our lives. With a swish of our finger, we are seeing things in a new way. So whether or not it's a political thing or it's a particular region of the world, that isn't what is happening right now. What's happening is the human experience has changed because of technology, and how we understand things have changed. And so influences come in a wide variety of ways. And so I think that there's merit in terms of what you're saying, in terms of how people see local grievances as bigger things. But we have seen, and we continue and will continue to see, groups, state actors and non-state actors, movements happening around the world that are attributing certain things to their cause. It is just the world we are living in today.
Yes, please.
I just want to take the three questions on the Sharia law and the moderate Islam, as well as the last question. I think it's important for us to realize that Islam, as it is practiced today, as it is preached today, as it is politicized today, is not monolithic or homogeneous. There's a lot of intra-Islamic contestation even going on among Muslims themselves. So this is where I think the question about where do we find the moderate voice? The moderate voice is one of the many voices. And that is a problem that we're facing now, because there's so many people or groups claiming to be the true or the right Islam. Right? So that's one. The question of the Sharia law, whether it should replace secular laws, that itself is also a reflection of this contestation, because scholars like me have looked at Sharia law, and actually it is a very modern kind of law. It's not even Quranic laws. It could derive principles from the Quran, but the way it's drafted today is just like any Western law. So there is a debate over that. There is contestation, and the forms of Sharia laws that we have in the world today can vary drastically from what's in Indonesia and what's in Malaysia, and of course what's in Singapore today. So there's no one set of Sharia law.
And just to clarify, you're drawing a distinction between Sharia law and the extreme versions like hudud.
Well, I wouldn't use even the label extreme. There's so many variations, because we don't even want to label whether this is the more extremist one, versus the other.
No, not extremist, but a more extreme version of it. There are various versions.
Oh, yeah,
right?
yeah, of course.
And we are not talking about, when you talk about Sharia, it's a whole broad range of things. Right?
Well, my point is really that is also the crux of the problem.
Yeah.
See? When we talk about Islamophobia, who are we labeling? Because there's so many people who are Islamists, right, and doing different things. I guess it boils down to power and authority. Who has the power?
Yes.
See, to proclaim that this is the right Islam? Because in different periods, various forms of Islam predominated, and today it could be something else. So it's got to do with politics. It's got to do with resources, I suppose. We have not talked about that, you see. Where are the resources coming from? Because that's very important. That's fueling the movement, a certain type of Islamic movement, versus the ones who are powerless, but the ones that we actually desire or want, but they don't have the resources.
Thank you. Minister, you want to respond to?
I think on the point about Sharia law, I think the undertone there seems to be that while we're having a separate set of special laws just for Muslims, when everyone else is subject to the civil law, the way in which the Sharia laws are organized, and you heard Mazna say, we have courts that look at and interpret the provisions, largely because they do have specialist knowledge, and there is a background to the way in which wills are drafted, successions and so on in estates are made, wakafs are set up, and so on. But that's not to say that all the other customs and religions and the way in which you might have accustomed to the way in which you succeed title or usage from before, all that is not taken into, all that is not removed for other people. If you are able to demonstrate that there's a way in which you look at custom or usage or history, and that affects the way in which you would interpret a provision, say in a will, that's also something that you bring into court, and that will be considered. So I wouldn't look at it as them and us and using the Sharia and civil law divide as saying that there's something special and unique, and therefore they pigeonhole Muslims into one box. That's not the case.
Any other panelists would like to respond to any other question that is brought up? Anything else specifically?
Was there another pigeonhole question?
Sorry?
Was there another pigeonhole question?
Well, there is a pigeonhole question that I want to ask. Pigeonhole is where questions come from within amongst you, as well as people from outside who are watching this live webcast. If the panelists don't have any more questions or comments that have come up to respond to, I'll just go with one. Ignorance about Islam and hate campaign by Western media are at the root of the phenomena of Islamophobia. What can be done by the intellectual leadership to correct this? So here's the question about the media, if I may just add to this, right? The media clearly plays a significant role, whether it's mainstream media or whether it is social media. It plays a significant role in shaping mentalities, right? Now, interestingly, there's some interesting information about in 2018, University of Alabama, there was a study that says that terror attacks committed by Muslim extremists receive, are you ready for this? 357% more US press coverage than those committed by non-Muslims. 357% more coverage. Now, this must be seen in the backdrop that between 2009 and 2018, right-wing white extremists in the USA accounted for 73% of killings in the USA, and Islamists 23%. So you see the difference? The white right-wing extremists in the USA were, this is official figures, 73% of the killings in the USA, Islamist killings, 23%, but the coverage given to terror attacks committed by Muslim extremists is 357% higher. That's the kind of figure that we're looking at. There's a lot more. There's a lot more here. There's a report by the Washington Post that also came up with similar stuff, you know. So there seems to be some form of a campaign. Remember what I said earlier about the $206 million funding? A lot of that funding could also be channeled to the media agencies as well. So this is what we are facing. This is huge. And this is not just within America, this is global. Okay? We're not even talking yet about social media campaigns. We're not even going there. This is mainstream media campaigns. You know. So the question is, this goes back to this question. What is it that we can do? What is it that we in Singapore, anywhere in the world, can do to deal with this sort of a campaign? This is a campaign. And do we believe that the campaign is going to abate over time naturally? May I ask the panelists to respond to this? Do you think that this is one of those things that will heal naturally, give it time, or is it going to get worse?
Yeah.
If you just leave it, is it going to get worse?
All eyes on me. I think back to your point about can we just let it fix itself? Can we let the
some people there are people who are arguing that leave it, it'll solve itself. Yeah. People will sort it out. Don't intervene.
Well, in my opinion, I think that kind of passivity is really not the way you solve a problem. I think, kudos to Singapore for updating its Racial and Religious Harmony Act. I mean, that is as a millennial, I do care about things like that because that is a big signposting that we will not stand for this kind of discrimination, and these are the kind of values we want to uphold. I don't think that this is an issue that can fix itself. If anything, I think we need more useful, reasoned, open discussion like this, not just loud voices speaking misinformation. We need more talk about this. And I think in terms of this hate campaign, the good thing about social media, I would say, is that, yes, the disinformation is everywhere. It's a plethora of it. But the good thing is you can correct that information almost immediately. So I think as people continue to educate themselves, when you read these corrections and updates from distinguished sources, then you can combat disinformation with instantaneous corrections and know this is actually what should have been said from reliable sources. So I would say that number one, this is not an issue that can be resolved automatically. You have to keep the conversation going. You have to be in touch with the everyday people and understand, have their perceptions really changed for the better, or has it gotten worse? You have to keep a close ear to the people. You also have to keep a close eye to the media as well and make sure that media outlets have stepped up their game towards correcting all these mistruths.
Yeah.
And thirdly, I think back to education again, that's like
Got it.
the top for
Thank
fixing
you.
this. Yeah, thanks.
Farah, quick comment?
Well, I thought the 3 points that you made were excellent. I'll add 2 more. One is, I want to just say one thing. I think social media is mainstream.
Okay. Yeah, yeah.
So let me just
It's become
let me just say that, okay?
Got
But
it. I correct myself,
in addition
yes.
to the 3 excellent points Victoria made, the pressure that we put on media teams to make sure that they are diverse, journalists and reporters are really important. You cannot have one segment of society only that are part of the mechanism within these companies. It does not work well. So you heard that conversation after 9/11, by the way,
Yep.
that there were only a certain kind of person that
Yes.
was reporting. So that one is the diversity within the people who are reporting on the news.
You see that happening? Is it beginning to
It's
happen?
changed since 9/11. I'm not saying it's perfect, but it has definitely changed. But 2, and this is a really important point, you raised 2 important studies that have been done. And I think the fact is there needs to be more research around that kind of data,
Yeah.
because that kind of data can actually become more of an eye-opening experience. And it shouldn't just be
Yeah.
U.S.-based research. It should
Yes.
be research in different parts of the world, so
World.
you're seeing how things are reported. The easiest thing in the world, and this is a comment, this is not like what can be done, but the easiest thing in the world is to blame the media for everything. And I get that. I understand the need to just lash out and do this. But the cognition for every human as they use their devices to learn news. Most people don't understand how algorithms work. And you don't understand where you and how you are learning and where you're learning the news. And I think this goes to Victoria's point about education. Yes, there's one point of education which is around your communities and the other and diversity and respect and all of that, humanity. But there's also a part of education that says, are parents teaching their children how algorithms work? So when they go down the rabbit hole, within 72 hours, all they're seeing is news that comes from people who think like they do. Do parents understand what's taking place? So there's another component of the education thing that I think is really important as well.
Thank you.
Well, I'm just zeroing on the question again because it seems to kind of finger Western media. So is that a problem? I mean, is that the case? The statistics that you brought up were basically about Western
US,
media.
yes.
Yeah. I think there's another axis here, maybe the alternate media that could come from, well, as you say, the Islamic world. And we haven't actually studied enough of that. And I think there's a lot of dissemination of information or dissemination through all these other devices that's actually providing an alternative to the Western media. Now, both could be bad.
Yeah,
The bad,
that's the biggest fear.
one bad against the other bad alternative. So I wouldn't know how to answer the last part of the question. What can be done by the intellectual leadership to correct this? I'm not sure, because the whole information sphere is very complicated now with social media. But Victoria has a good point. And she says that we can all correct whatever is considered fake news today. It's like everybody does it, right? At the same time, simultaneously. But where is the source? Where is the center? I think that's what we're facing today. Where is the center, of this ideology, whether it's from the West or from the other side?
Yeah. And clearly, we are not talking about creating more perspectives, because it can be very confusing and confounding for the uninitiated receiver, right? What we are really looking at is making the media a lot more accountable and a lot more responsible in the way they conduct. And there needs to be people to watch the media, to hold them to account. Minister.
Well, I think to your original question as to whether we can leave it alone and do nothing and take a hands-off approach, I think absolutely not. I think we have to run just to keep at the level that we are now. And I think to borrow Farah's point, I think we really need to bring in the whole of all of me, whether it's the individual, the corporates, government. I think everyone has to play a bigger role increasingly. And I think that on the media point, we have a rise in really hate speech now. The world is getting more polarized.
That's right.
everyone has a view and is not afraid to share that view. And I think what has changed in the last 10 to 15 years is that those views are powered by social media online. And there's a degree of anonymity that the purveyor of that comment or hate speech can hide behind. And the combination of these two things mean that we now need to regulate what that space begins to look like. Victoria says that, well, we can correct it and all will be good. If we can do that every time, each time, good. But we can't. And so therefore we do need tools and mechanisms like the ability in POFMA to intervene when you have false information. We all remember that after the terrorist attack at Westminster in London, there was this picture of Muslims celebrating that went around. It went viral very quickly, very extensively. That was completely false. It was the Indians celebrating victory at a cricket match. And as you can imagine, they did so wildly. But it was purveyed on social media as Muslims celebrating the stabbings that took place at Westminster, and then caused tensions thereafter. So these are things that I think we need to curate. We need to have a platform where there's a free marketplace of ideas, where we can regulate each other. But at the same time, I believe that what we have done in Singapore is the right approach. Set up a framework by the state, have those OB markers, have the parameters, but leave the community, like on occasions like this, to have that free discourse. And I think that's what over time will help us to overcome these problems.
Thank you. I'd like to now ask each panelist 30 seconds, no more, to say, recommend one thing that you believe is critical to solving the problem. Just one that you believe very strongly is going to be playing a pivotal role in changing the course. Victoria?
Well, I would say from a student perspective, I think just being more critical and challenging yourself as an everyday person to use some brain power and really think about what you're reading, regardless of whether it might be true or not true. If you read something, check it against another source. Don't be too quick to believe, I would say. Using basic human reasoning, just actively question what you are reading to make sure that you're not endorsing something that is a mistruth, like was mentioned by a minister.
Yeah. But that would require us to introduce critical thinking from very early in life. Yeah.
We have.
Yeah.
Don't we? Look at Victoria.
Look at Victoria, yes. We need more young people like her.
Yes, we do.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Farah.
So I think a very basic question to ask is, what kind of world do you want to live in? And what are you doing as an individual to make that world what you want it to be? And that could go for anything. I mean, you can look at an issue like climate change and say it is so overwhelming, there's no way we can get our hands around it and we'll never be able to get past it. Hate is something that is overwhelming and it is emotional. And you can think, I can't boil the ocean, we're never going to get there, and it's all doom and gloom and it's never going to be able to be solved. If you buy into that philosophy, that's the life you're going to live. If you say to yourself, that's not the kind of community I want to be in, that's not who I am, that's not what I want my neighbors to be, you can come back to a place that you can control. It's not like we live in some weird world where a Martian is controlling you're in charge of how you behave. You're in charge of how you elect your local neighborhood, people and community centers, and you're in charge of what you do on Diwali or Eid or Christmas or whatever, and the language that you use. You have ownership over those things. Use it.
And step up.
I don't know. This may be very is heretical maybe for some people, but I think. Personally, I think we should then ask again what is the meaning of religion and what it does to oneself. There was a time when religion was not really controlled by the bureaucracy, by politicians, by structures, by economies, where you have kind of a direct contact with the maker or the power. And I think that's a very difficult philosophy, I think, to hang on to today. But I think that there should be more movements toward that. Just just divorce religion, you see, from politics and structures and well, I would say the Weberian concept, you see, of this worldly, too much of this worldly concern, but to look at something outer, a more transcendental meaning of religion.
Thank you, Mr.
Well, I agree with all of that.
That's good.
But I would add one practical step, which I think is this. I think it's important, as we've heard from the audience as well, that we dispel doubts and maybe even misapprehensions about each other's faiths. And I'm not just talking about Muslims. And I think the more we get together as a community, the more we partake in social events, intellectual events like this debates, discourse, on an interfaith basis, the better we will be able to understand each other, to have that one-on-one dialogue, to have that group dialogue, better understand each other, and better free ourselves of the doubts that I think carry that word into its being, which is Islamophobia. And I think the more occasions like this that we generate in our community and our society, the better it will be. I may be a little bit too optimistic, but I believe that occasions like this really help it. Sitting here myself tonight, listening to my panelists, listening to people in the audience, I think I've gained a lot as well, listening to your views, your perspectives. And I think that's what it should be, not just on occasions like this, but on social ones as well.
Thank you, Minister. As the moderator, I'm going to entitle myself to two comments, to two suggestions. One is, I do believe that we need to do a serious relook, re-examination of policies that go against the grain of true multi-religious, multi-racial society that we are. I think we have to be honest in that examination, and we've got to be truthful in the way we speak to ourselves, especially if we are in positions of power. We have a high responsibility to ensure that. For me, that's the first. Every society needs and has the responsibility to look again and again, because circumstances change, look at whether what was relevant and made sense 10 years ago continues to make sense today. That's number one. And the final point I'd like to make is this. I'd like to quote Farah. Let's stop being lazy on hate. I love that line. Thank you. Let's stop being lazy on hate. Yeah. And the important thing is, let's not make the mistake of kicking the can down the road, because somebody else is going to pay the price for your complacency. We as adults are going to force our children and their generation to pay the price for us kicking the can down the road. And we are doing that. And I think Farah has reminded us of that complacency and that laziness again and again. We have the powerful capacity to rationalize and to make ourselves feel less guilty. But maybe we should stop that process and start feeling guilty for what we are not doing. All of us. And let's stop making excuses that we should not have these sensitive discussions because it'll hurt people. That's a cop-out. It's not about dealing with things it's not about disagreeing. It's about learning to disagree in a manner that is not disagreeable. And I think that's really what we need to learn. And that can come about only when we have these honest discourses. I'd like to thank NUS for actually giving my committee and me the support for going ahead. Eng Chai, thank you very much for going ahead with this. And I'd like you to join me, please, in thanking my panelists. I shall now hand it over to the MC.
Thank you, panelists, for your insights on this topic. We would now like to invite Mr. Edwin Tong, Senior Minister of State for Law and Health, to present the prizes to the winners of the essay competition. The second runner-up is Mr. Ip Chen Yuan Brandon, an alumnus from the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences, class of 2018. first runner-up is Miss Victoria Burrow, Year 2 student from the Singapore Management University. And the winner is Mr. Fadhil Yunus Elsagov, an alumnus from the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences, class of 2018. Thank you, Mr. Tong. We would now like to invite NUS President, Professor Tan In Chai, on stage to present tokens of appreciation to our panelists. Firstly, we have Mr. Edwin Tong, Ms. Farah Pandif, Associate Professor Masna Muhammad, and lastly, Ms. Victoria Burrow. We will now have a group photograph of all panelists and essay competition winners. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for participating in the You Alive session brought to you by NUS Alumni Relations. Please join us outside at the Benefactors Foyer for a networking reception. Thank you, and we look forward to seeing you at the next You Alive.